How's that? Does that work better?
Yes.
Still, okay. Yeah, if you can't hear me, just wave, because I do tend to drop my voice. So if you're an artist, you may have learned Leonardo's principle is dividing a canvas into 3 parts. I mean, actually 9 parts, but into thirds, and you sort of try and balance out all the things in different parts. Or there's another Leonardo's principle where you divide the face, basically the top half of the face from your eyes up is half of your entire distance here, and then you can divide it and so forth. All right. So if you look up Leonardo's principle, you're going to find several Leonardo's principles. This is the third one, which is probably the least known, but the most important to scientists. And that is something that he was investigating simply in terms of how can you draw trees accurately. So this is in a part of his notebooks where he's addressing artists and telling them, when you look at a tree, how do you portray it so it looks like a real tree? And he says all the branches of a tree at every stage of its height, when put together, are equal in thickness to the trunk below them. So that all the branches of a water course, for example, he's comparing this to a river, at every stage in its course, if they are of equal rapidity, are equal to the body of the main stream. Now, making this connection between water and branches becomes very important, although it's not clear that Leonardo actually investigated it or followed it up. So here's another way of looking at it. You probably know that Leonardo wrote, a mirror image. I flipped this around so you don't have to do it in your head. Another way of talking about it, as he said, was that every year when the boughs of a plant or a tree have made an end of maturing their growth, they will have made, when put together, a thickness equal to that of the main stem. And at every stage of its ramification, you will find the thickness of the said main stem as L and K, G and H, E and F, C and D, A and B will always be equal to each other, unless you've chopped the tree off and cut off its branches and so forth. Okay, so it's very simple and straightforward. When you look at the way people actually draw trees, they often don't do this, and this is why trees don't look quite right when people don't know what they're doing. Interestingly, in the mid-19th century, John Ruskin, again addressing the same problem for artists, came up with the same solution, and you can read that on the side there if you want to do it. But basically, in even more artistic and flowery language, he basically says the same thing, that when you look at a tree and try to draw all the different parts of it, all of the circumferences should add up to the circumference of the branches should add up to the circumference of the trunk. So these are 2 artists writing for artists, coming up with a very general principle about the way that nature works. Leonardo's made a very nice analogy to water courses, that rivers develop their shapes in the same way. And what ends up happening is around 1920, there's a guy named Darcy Thompson. He's a very famous biologist. He wrote a famous book called On Growth and Form, which is still in print. It's been in print since 1916. It's never been out of print. It's been translated into something like 27 different languages. And he went around and basically looked at everything that artists were talking about, trying to understand form, which is not something that most biologists think much about. There is no, in fact, science of form even today. It's a great big gap. And the first attempt was by Darcy Thompson. He picks up on both Ruskin and Leonardo, and he puts them all together, saying there's something very interesting going on, which he basically summarizes as what is now called the water pipe model of hydrodynamics. So if you think about a tree, and this is probably the way that Leonardo comes at this problem, maybe Ruskin as well, every leaf has to get a certain amount of sap or water coming up to it. So if we look at the full-grown tree and we now follow that water back to where it started, down in the root somewhere, every leaf has to get essentially the same amount of water. So you could imagine a set of little tiny pipes going from every leaf all the way down to through the trunk. And what you'll end up with is something that looks like this. Well, this has been flattened out. But if you now think about this as a circular object, then you realize that the circumferences at any point as you go through all the branches all continue to add up to the same amount because you always have the same number of pipes of the same width coming down. Okay, it's a very simple principle. It also explains very nicely how the evaporation at the leaf continues to draw the sap up at a continuous rate and so forth and so on, why you get the shape of the tree that you get. There's a huge amount of research. Nobody's entirely convinced in plant biology that this is the only principle at work in the growth and form of plants, but it's certainly the major theory at the moment. Now, the interesting thing was you look at Leonardo, is he goes and he says, well, the same thing's happening in the bronchi and the lungs, same thing's happening in tree roots. Eventually you get Mandelbrot with fractals, who literally pulls all of this, everything that's in Darcy Thompson, in Leonardo and everybody else, together into a new form of mathematics, which explains all of this as well. So just to show you, here's a series of some fairly modern research that's still going on. This is a very active area of research, people trying to understand in animal physiology, plant physiology, lots of areas, how this pipe model might actually work, what the limitations are, other types of principles that work at the same time, and so forth. What's the lesson here? Especially since many of you may take next semester's course. First of all, these are not two artists who are trying to find a scientific discovery. Okay? And this is often the case. Artists who make contributions to science don't necessarily or even often start out trying to make a scientific discovery. They were trying to solve an art problem. But what they did, excuse me, that's somewhat different than what most artists do, is they looked for the general principle. How could you draw any tree? Is there a way that you could teach someone the principles by which you do that? And you're going to see this lesson reappear in lots of forms as I go through and continue lecturing. So there's one key to thinking about art and science. Because it's a general principle, it now applies to nature in general. Okay, so if you are now a scientist coming and looking at the same kinds of problems, if the artists have done their job, they have given the scientists clues as to where to start, and that's clearly what happened here. All right, here's another example. Abbott Thayer. Abbott Thayer was an American painter, late 19th and into the early 20th century. Excuse me. He's represented a lot of the major art galleries in the country. Known mainly for his paintings of beautiful women and angels. This comes a lot out of his personal life. His wife and several of his kids died of disease when they were quite young. And he also was one of the very first Impressionist painters in the United States. And you can see he wasn't doing Impressionism borrowed from Europe. This is his own style of Impressionism, so it's quite unique. So he had a very large reputation during his time and even since. But he had another life as well. He loved to hunt. He loved the outdoors. He particularly liked birds. He was a very avid conservationist and one of the founders of many of the conservation movements at the time. And you have a self-portrait here. You can see him. In fact, almost all of his self-portraits show him in his hunting gear. He started painting birds the way he saw them when he either shot them or was simply hunting them in order to paint them or whatever he was doing. And you can see one of the birds here, and had a very interesting artistic problem as a result. He would paint these paintings, put them up in the galleries along with the other kinds of paintings you just saw, and no one would buy them. In fact, most people would walk right past this without seeing anything in it. And if you think about Audubon's paintings, I'm sure you've all seen the Audubon prints. The reason is very simple. People in the late 19th century expected to see a bird against a white background. If you went into a natural history museum, you saw a bird against a white background. I mean, they're mounted so that they are shown in their full glory. And what Thayer was doing was saying, but that's not the way birds are. Birds live in an environment. So I want to show them in the environment. I want to show them how they actually exist. And in that sense, he was very much an evolutionary biologist. He read lots of evolutionary biology. He wanted to understand everything in the terms in which nature actually showed it to him. So here are some more of the paintings and photographs that he took. A rabbit, obviously hidden in the debris where he found it. A moth, if you can see this, against the bark in which it's hiding. What he discovered was camouflage. And this is actually quite astounding from an historical perspective. You have Darwin inventing the theory of natural selection in 1860. It's immediately followed by the discovery of various forms of mimicry, Müllerian mimicry, Batesian mimicry, one animal mimicking another one in order to protect itself. It has big red stripes because I'm dangerous, stay away from me, even though I'm not dangerous. I just am mimicking another animal that is dangerous, things like that. Nobody, not a single person, had thought about the fact that animals could also adapt to their environment. It took an artist to see this. I mean, this is really astounding. So, literally for 50 years, people studied evolutionary biology without seeing camouflage. All right, so why did Thayer see it? One of the reasons I've already given you is he's a hunter and he's a painter, okay? He's a hunter, he knows it's hard to see animals, he pays attention to it, but then a lot of the evolutionary biologists were hunters too. Darwin certainly was. But he also actually used an evolutionary process in his own painting. And I think in many cases, this connection between your method and the subject you end up actually studying is very important. You have to match what you're good at and the way you work with what it is that you want to actually accomplish. And I've seen lots of people fail at almost anything they do because they don't have the right set of skills or they don't work in the right way to actually succeed at what they're trying to do. So matching is really important here. His process was to essentially use evolution. So evolution requires that you have a way to reproduce valuable traits, that the inheritable variations occur among these traits. That is, they can be passed on, some get selected out, and there is non-random selection. That is, if it's just random selection, you don't move anywhere, but if you only select out the bad ones and you keep the good ones, then something's going to change. Well, Thayer had this really bad habit which drove him into using this approach. He used to overpaint all his paintings. He would start painting something, and then he'd say, oh, I can improve it a little bit more. Oh, no, that didn't improve it very much, so I'll try this. Oh, I'll try this, and well, he'd ruin all his paintings. So what he ended up doing was making copies. Eventually, he became famous enough he could hire students to do this. He would make a painting, work on it for a week, then he'd have his students come in, make copies of the painting. So he'd have 5 different copies of the 1-week-old painting. He would work differently on each of those 5 paintings. After another week, he would stop. He would look at them all and say, this one's the right one, destroy the other 4, make 5 new ones of the one he liked, work on that for another week. Literally natural selection at work. Okay, and that way he didn't ruin his paintings. He could always go back and take one of the copies that was still good and use that. When he starts looking at camouflage, he uses the same approach. Okay, so he's looking at these animals, and one thing he notices is they all have colorations that are broken up, or many of them do. And so he starts thinking about just patterns. If I have a pattern of triangles, so he's thinking like an artist, and I color each of the triangles a different color, and now I put it against different backgrounds, what happens to it? Well, the shape that I see now changes. If it was sort of this square with a triangle hanging off of it, well, now I get different shapes when I put it against different colors. Part of it disappears. If I take more complex shapes, they do really weird things. Even, it can even hide letters if you break up the outline appropriately. He very quickly realizes that breaking up these outlines is very useful, tries to get the US Army to adopt camouflaged uniforms. Again, if you know any of your history, this is the time basically when Teddy Roosevelt is leading the charge up San Juan Hill. He is dressed in a bright white uniform. Shoot me! All of his men are in blue and red. Shoot me! And basically, we have Thayer saying, this is stupid. You should be whatever color your environment is so that you can't find a target. Why are you making yourself targets? This is crazy. When you get to World War I, the US government does not still adopt camouflage until everybody else does, but the British immediately see the utility in breaking up the outlines of things, and the people who actually implement it are the vorticists. This is a group you may not have heard of, but a very famous set of painters in England, and they're actually hired by the government to implement camouflage. And so they're doing these paintings along with actually painting the ships and the airplanes and things like that. Eventually, this breaking up the pattern, there's a very famous portrait here of Joseph Beuys by Andy Warhol, which is sort of the ultimate in making this, again, into a pure art form. All right, there are exceptions. And they are smart enough to realize that there are some exceptions. So when he's looking at these rabbits, they have fairly plain backs. And you've probably seen deer. They're pretty much the same shade all over. But there's very interesting difference in these, which is they also have light bellies. Have you ever thought about why an animal has a light belly? And all the animals that have light bellies run around during the day, because if you look at moles and other things that live underground or only come out at night, they don't have light bellies. So Thayer starts thinking about this, says, what is going on with this? All right. So again, he starts doing these experiments, and they're very much artistic ones. He takes a bird, for example, and over on the lower left here, he's got a bird that is counter painted. So he just took a bird model, he painted the bottom dark and the top light. And he lights this from the top. You can see the bird sticking out like crazy. Now, on the left part of that left-hand picture, there's supposed to be a second bird. I'm not sure that he didn't fake this photograph, but if we accept that he actually did it, there is a second bird that has been shaded the opposite way. It's been painted dark on top and light on the bottom, and when it's lit from on top, that evens out all the shading across the entire bird so it looks perfectly gray. When he takes a hat, puts it on top of his little cabinet to block the light, all of a sudden that bird shows up, and you can see how it was painted dark with a light underbelly. So what he's saying here is basically that animals that run around in bright sunlight evolved light bellies because that protects them from being seen. If they're the same color all over, their top's going to look light, their bottom's going to look dark. If they're counter-shaded so that they actually have light on top, dark on the bottom, they're going to stick out like crazy. Again, an adaptation. This isn't to say that Thayer was perfect. He has a book on camouflage and concealment in nature, where he also has wonderful illustrations like this, where he claims that the flamingo has evolved to disappear into the sunset. And if you think about that, that's just silly because, first of all, there's not a nice sunset every night, and second of all, it lasts about 2 minutes. So how could this really be adaptive for something that's, out in the sunlight 14 hours of the rest of the day? So he got that wrong. We now think that basically these bright colors actually are a way of showing other animals that this is a really great food source, number one. And two, if there are thousands of bright animals all flocking together, then a predator is going to have a real problem latching onto one of them as a target. So there are two ways that you could possibly use that kind of patterning or coloration to protect yourself. So here there is principles. One is the principle of disruptive patterning. So that's where you break up the outline of the organism. The second is the counter shading, where wherever something would be shaded, you make it light. Wherever something would be in the sunlight, you make it dark. And so that evens out the overall coloration of the animal. He's using a evolutionary method which matches the kinds of research he's actually doing. And it's also very important, he generalizes everything to all animals. He's very much like Leonardo and Ruskin. This principle works on rivers and trees and the lungs and everything else. Thayer's also doing the same thing. This is very unusual for an artist or even a scientist. Most scientists don't think in this way. That made it very valuable. All right, here's another example. Here's a person who is both an artist and a scientist. So everything he did, he actually did as both purposefully. A guy named Desmond Morris. He's still alive. I've actually met him a couple of times. He's a lot of fun. His most famous book is called The Naked Ape. Anybody heard of this? Okay, so only a couple people. You really should take a look at this. This was a breakthrough book basically saying, we have evolution and we're all talking about how we evolved from primates and so forth, but nobody's taking this seriously. Let's take it seriously. So he goes into all sorts of wonderful things like, why do men have penises that hang out? And why do women have breasts that hang down? And why do women put on makeup? You don't want to know the answer. I'm not going to tell you that. You'll have to read the book. Why do men wear ties? I'll give you a hint. This is basically the penis on your chest. The bigger and brighter the tie, the more manly I am. I mean, he's got all sorts of really crazy, but they're all based in all sorts of fun things about animal displays. And, so he pushes this as far as he can put it. And it really opened a lot of people's eyes and made them think, well, how much of an animal are we? How much of the things that we take as being advanced culture are really simply another way of exhibiting basic animal traits like fighting for territory and mates and all those kinds of things. In order to do that, he also was a painter, a surrealist painter. The one on the left there is a self-portrait of him as a bug, and he talks very much about the way that he gets his insights is to become the object that he is studying. So unlike Thayer, who's actually he's almost working scientifically as an outsider looking at things, Morris gets inside and says, if I want to understand how a bug operates or how a primate operates, I have to be the bug. I have to look at the world the way the bug looks at the world. I have to look at it the way the primate looks at the world. Otherwise, I'm going to make mistakes in anthropomorphizing everything and thinking about it as a human being. And that's not good. So at one point, he has this huge breakthrough when he's actually about 16 years old. The painting on the left is his breakthrough painting where he suddenly realizes that he can go into this other world in his dreams and imagine what the world would be like. The first painting obviously is not very impressive, but he spends the rest of his career exploring the way evolution could work through his paintings. Not looking at real things, but evolving animals in an imaginary world. And if you're interested in imaginary worlds, these occur, scientists use them, artists use them, lots of people use them. My wife just wrote a book called Imaginary Worlds, world play, so lots of people were doing this. Morris is one of them. So among the things that he did, he's done many things, but one of the most interesting was he was the first person, again, to ask something that should have been obvious even to Darwin, but nobody really asked, which is, why do we make art? When does it evolve? What's the biological purpose? Okay, did art evolve because we painted our bodies, so because we're hairless? Okay, we can't run around and do what animals do and show display, so we display ourselves by painting ourselves or dabbing mud on ourselves or whatever it happens to be. Is that why we put dresses on and coats and things like that? Are these all forms of art? But he wants to go back. If art has an evolutionary value, then at some point we should see the precursors to art. So he does some really strange things. He became head of the London Zoo. He gives a chimp named Congo some brushes and paint, and I mean, he goes crazy. This animal just sits down and starts painting, and he will paint for anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes and scream bloody murder if you take the painting away before he's done. He'll also scream bloody murder if you give him a painting he's already done and he doesn't want to do anything more on it. He knows very well when he's finished, and he knows very well when you're interfering with his painting. So here are some of the different kinds. Mainly paint fan shapes, and this is what most chimpanzees do. He gets to the point where he can sort of make circular blobs. These are the kinds of things that 3-year-olds, human beings, do. So they're actually direct parallels with what chimps do. They very rarely get past about a 3-year-old human stage, but parallels up to that point, which Desmond Morris studies. Gorillas are more interesting. So these are by Coco. Coco was the signing gorilla. So she could actually tell her keepers what she was doing. And these are a set of 3 which are really interesting because the one on the left she named Chase. And it was named Chase after she had chased after the dog that you see in the photograph down there. The middle one is Flowers. And the one on the right is Red Berry. So these almost look like they're representational, which puts her way beyond what the chimps could do, and maybe into the 5-year-old, maybe 6-year-old range for a human being. So Morris basically, by using both his art and his science simultaneously, starts asking really interesting questions. Why do we make art? And if you think about it, into what field does this question lie? Is this an artistic question? Is it a scientific question? Is it a question simply about being human? What methods do we use? How do we focus on it? Clearly, there's a basic principle here. Animals will make art if given the chance. Human beings make art if given the chance. And we don't know why. So this opens up all sorts of possibilities. All right, Bucky Fuller. Getting more modern here. You probably all know Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes. We see them all over the place. Again, an artist with very general principles. I'm not going into the background because lots has been written about him. But basically, everything he did was based on the idea of comprehensive anticipatory design science, which sounds sort of like nonsense. But basically what he's saying here is that there are fundamental structural and energy principles that exist everywhere in the world. That nature has already figured out how to maximally use energy with the least waste, how to make structures that are as stable as possible with the least material. And if we study nature, then we can come up with those principles, which is basically what he was trying to do in all of his work. And the geodesic dome is, the most space that you can cover with the least amount of material. All right, so his basic point in a lot of his philosophical writings is that humanity has to learn how nature performs functions in order that we can perform our functions in nature most appropriately. So he became very famous in the 1950s. I mean, he was on the covers of virtually every magazine you could imagine. New television start coming and he gets interviewed. He's everywhere. He's the megastar. When people in the sciences start trying to figure out virus structures, they look at these geodesic domes and they say, well, if he's right about these anticipatory design principles, maybe they would apply to viruses. So one of the people who did this was a guy named Don Casper. He was actually living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was at Harvard at the time. The photograph of him up there in the upper left was actually taken by Bucky Fuller when he came over to visit his house. He invited Bucky Fuller to give lectures at Harvard on this design principle. And on the left there, you can see one of Buckminster Fuller's patents. On the right is one of Don Casper's drawings of how, if you had proteins that looked basically like hands, we have an analogy here, how would those hands intersect to make a virus structure? So they had long discussions about this, and if you actually read the papers that Casper publishes, he cites Buckminster Fuller as the source of his inspirations and the basic design principles that go into the viruses. And in fact, when you look at these viruses, you can see that there are groups of 6 and groups of 5.